Hello students, this is a review of the financial statement presentation for Concord Hospital. I will also save this as a PowerPoint for your review as well. So this is the introductory slide, gives a little bit of pictures to the institution, and this is something that you should use the format for your final presentation. Obviously, it doesn't need to be the exact same, but something similar. This was done by a student last semester. This tells us about the healthcare entity, it's acute care hospital, number of beds, so forth. Gives a little bit more about who they are, the subsidiaries, and here are some assumptions and key items. So the financial statement report, they did not find anything wrong with it. They issued an unqualified report. They're a not-for-profit entity. They have no material litigation going on. They have some leases, as you can see, and subsequent to the financial statements, they are in contract discussions with another institution to look at creating an agreement. They provide charity care, and they do this, they have a policy about this, and total charity care for the year was $7.8 million in 2000 and $7.2 million in 1999. You can also see here that they provide services to patients who have Medicare and Medicaid, and part of the charity care includes $14.3 million for the year ended 2000 and $9.2 million for the year ended 1999. That was in excess of the payments that they received. So when healthcare institutions perform services on Medicare and Medicaid patients, they don't always cover their costs. So that's what this is getting at. And this is not included in the information below. If we look at the mix of the accounts receivable at the end of the year, you can see that on the screen. Patients was 27%, which is less than the 33% for the year before, which is a good thing because we know patients don't always pay their bills for medical bills. Medicare stayed relatively the same, as did Blue Cross. They had an increase in an HMO, which may or may not be good. HMOs tend to pay less, but they had a good increase in their commercial business, which is good. That tends to pay more. Medicaid went up a little bit, and other third-party payers went down, and a little increase in workers' compensation. So overall, there wasn't a huge change in their payer mix from year to year. In looking at the balance sheet, we show that there is a significant increase, or decrease rather, in cash from 1999 to 2000 to the tune of $4.8 million. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the statement of cash flows. Also, we see a big variance in the board designated funds, so they had more investments, so perhaps maybe some of that cash went to the investments. And when we go to liabilities, we see things are fairly consistent with a little bit of an increase in the accrued compensation over there. The long-term debt showed a little bit of a decrease and a bit of an increase in the pension liability. Looking at the net assets section, we see there is an increase in unrestricted net assets by about $12 million, and we see about $1 million, almost $2 million in the temporary restricted, and $1 million in the permanently restricted. And so the balance sheet seems to be relatively stable. Moving over to the statement of operations, they show an increase of 8%, or $10.5 million in net patient service revenue from 1999 to 2000, and so that certainly impacts the total operating revenue. We see revenues are up, but we also see that expenses are up. And so major differences here. We can see, really varied from 4.7 million under salaries, another 1.5 million under employee benefits, and almost 3 million in purchase services. Net income from operations stayed relatively flat, about the same as last year. Of note that investment income was up significantly, $2.4 million. And so at the end of the year, their excess of revenues over expenses actually was up by $2.5 million. So notice as I went through this, I rounded numbers and just went through it relatively quickly. Now we're going to look at some of the key ratios here. We're going to look at the current ratio, which tells us how likely they are able to pay their current debt. And we have 1999, 2000, and the benchmark. So here you can see in 1999 they were above the benchmark, 2000 they dipped below, and so we have a little bit of concern whether they can pay their current liabilities, but one ratio we shouldn't make an assumption about. These other ones here tell a similar story. Here, looking at the days in accounts receivable, we want to be below the benchmark, and here we are above in both years, and so that causes some concern as to why they're having a trouble converting their receivables into cash. Days cash on hand, both years they are well above the benchmark, trending favorably to 179 versus a benchmark of 102. So that gives us good confidence that they have cash to pay their bills and so forth. Average payment period tells us how long it takes them to pay their bills. We want to be below the benchmark, and so they are doing a good job below the benchmark, trending a little bit unfavorably. In terms of revenues and expenses, we see here that looking at the operating revenue per admission, that the benchmark is 6,766 for an entity with under 200 to 299 beds. So here their revenue is much greater than the benchmark and trending very favorably from the prior year. However, their expenses are much greater than the benchmark and trending unfavorably. So all in all, it seems that things are pretty even. When we look at the salaries and benefits as a percentage of the total operating expenses, we see the benchmark's 38%, and for both years they are well above the benchmark. And so that may be something that they want to look into. Looking at the profitability ratios, the key one that we want to focus on here is the operating margin. We would like to see a 4% margin, that's the benchmark, and they are below that both years and trending unfavorably. This gives us cause for concern in that will they have enough money to reinvest in themselves, to buy new equipment, to buy electronic medical records and things like that. The next we want to talk about are some activity ratios, and the one we'll focus on is the age of plant ratio, which tells us, is their plant and equipment current, new, or is it old? So the benchmark here is about 12 years, and we are at 7.32, trending favorably from the prior year, and so that tells us they have invested in new equipment, new plant, and it looks good. So next we want to look at some of the capital structure ratios. How much debt do they have? How does that look? So we're going to look at the long-term debt to net assets ratio. We want to be below the benchmark, and in both years they are below the benchmark, and so it looks like they aren't overly burdened with debt. We know a lot of healthcare facilities are, in that they have to borrow in order to purchase large equipment and electronic medical records and so forth. So if I was the CFO, here are things that I would want to think about. I would want to think about how we can improve the operating margin. Specifically, how can we either reduce expenses or increase revenue? Or ideally, you would want to look at both. We would also want to look into specifically salaries and benefits. Is there any opportunity where we could lower some of those? Maybe that includes options like early retirement packages for some of the older staff, things like that. Also, we would want to look at the accounts receivable, right? Why is it taking us so long to convert our accounts receivable into cash? If I was a bank loan officer, I would think highly of loaning them money. They have a strong cash position given their days cash on hand, and they seem to pay their bills on time, and while their margin is a little bit low, it does seem as though they are making profit. And so I would want to understand what their plan is for the future, and looking out several years, and what issues are that are preventing them from getting onto the benchmark. And from the perspective of the community, I think we see that they provide a good amount of charity care. It's reassuring to know that their age of plant ratio is lower, or that they have newer equipment. And I think we may be concerned about the operating margin, in that if that continues to decline, they won't have the money to reinvest, and so that may be of concern. So overall, I think that Concord Hospital is doing a fairly decent job, and looks to a bright future.